Suddenly, Ling broke free from Lucia's arms and curiously asked, "Sister Nightingale, do you like the prince?" Ling recalled that her mother said if a name is mentioned by a girl many times, it means that person is very important to that girl. Lucia's face stiffened at her sister's question. Goodness, how could she ask such a thing directly? It was incredibly impolite. In a panic, Lucia hurriedly covered Ling's mouth, intended to apologize. However, she was taken aback when Nightingale candidly replied, "Yes, I like the prince." Lucia brought the minerals to meet the prince, still echoing Nightingale's words in her ears. She couldn't help but be amazed by Nightingale's open attitude. It seemed impossible for a witch and a prince to be together. The lord of the border town appeared just as usual, with a slightly sleepy look, indicating that he had recently awakened from a nap. Leaning back in his chair, he seemed relaxed, his tone amiable, completely unlike other nobles who were usually stern. The prince frowned and carefully examined the minerals in his palm, one by one. He didn't recognize these minerals and planned to have Kyle identify them. He instructed Lucia to continue practicing her abilities in the backyard. However, just as Lucia was about to leave, Roland called her back. He praised Lucia for her performance on the test and expressed his hope that Ling would also participate with everyone next time. Lucia excitedly responded and bowed before leaving. As Roland watched the little girl depart with joy, he sighed while looking at the metallic particles on the table. He had been too naive, thinking that he could use Lucia's abilities to uncover the hidden mineral in the Northern Slope mine. However, reality made him realize the vast gap between mechanical engineering and geology. In terms of color and shape, they were nearly indistinguishable. For example, metals like iron, aluminum, magnesium, and potassium appeared as silver-white metals in their high-purity state, making it extremely difficult to discern them with the naked eye. It seemed he would have to rely on Kyle to solve this problem. Just then, a guard pushed the door open and walked in, carrying a confidential letter from the capital city. Roland set aside his quill and opened the envelope. The letter had no signature, and the handwriting was unfamiliar, but a single sentence indicated that it was undoubtedly from Tassa. It stated that a force of approximately 1,000 people had left the capital today and was heading towards the western frontier. At the Changji Stronghold Theater, as the audience's continuous whistles and applause echoed, the curtain slowly descended. May wiped the sweat off her forehead and looked at Eileen, who was filled with excitement. May nodded slightly in response. As soon as the curtain fell, Eileen couldn't help but rush forward and tightly hugged May. Her acting had received May's approval. May believed that the other young girl's acting was not up to par: stiff expressions, slow movements, lacking emotions. She pointed out all the mistakes, making the little girl teary-eyed. A backstage crew member chuckled and remarked that May was indeed strict. May shook her head, noting that most of the audience today were commoners. If they were nobles, they would nitpick endlessly. Suddenly, a group of people surrounded them. These people were all actors from the theater, and May recognized the leading woman. Bella sneered, calling May and the group all inept actors from the countryside, continuing to mock and taunt them. Her words prompted laughter from the crowd behind her. Eileen retorted, mentioning the enthusiastic cheers from the audience. Bella, with disdain, mocked, referring the audience as people who deals with mud and shovels every day cannot be called an audience. She then said even if few monkeys get up on the stage to walk around, they would still cheer loudly. If it weren't for the free tickets, no one would have watched their crap show. Bella raised her voice, stating that their theater's income had significantly decreased because of accommodating the group's performances. After all, the nobles refused to attend since nobody wanted to sit on chairs filled with mud and grease stains. Bella's intentions were clear. Her seemingly scolding Eileen and the others were actually directed at May herself. May turned around casually and said, "The decrease in theater income is not solely due to free admission. The theater management has undoubtedly reached an agreement with His Royal Highness and Lord Petrov. The necessary funds will naturally be supplemented by the Border Town Municipal Hall. This is a business contract, not child's play. She finds it ironic that Bellet is a brainless shrew who only knows how to shout and scream. Furthermore, the witch's diary was written by His Royal Highness himself. Does Bella want to imply that His Highness's thoughts are low and vulgar? Insulting the royal aristocracy can result in severe punishment, such as the punishment of losing one's voice. Bella gritted her teeth and said, May went to the border town, not to see Eileen, but for Ferlin. Her voice abruptly stopped as a bright red palm mark appeared on her left cheek. Bella couldn't believe it as she touched her face. May took a deep breath. She had acted on impulse. Two male actors behind Bella stepped forward, condemning May's actions while slowly approaching her. May smirked inwardly. Yes, she had acted impulsively, but she saw no reason to apologize. She glared at the two men. She couldn't help but recall what Carter had once said. While men may possess greater strength, they also have many weaknesses. Certain attacks can instantly render them defenseless. Although she wasn't quite sure how the conversation had led to this, she was prepared to strike if these two men came any closer. Just then, the door to the dressing room was violently pushed open, and a knight in armor walked in. Several armed warriors with spears followed closely behind him. As they entered the room, they aimed their spears at the crowd. May couldn't help but freeze, blinking her eyes, thinking that what she was witnessing was an illusion. However, nothing changed. She even saw a smile sneakily appear on the knight's face. The knight was none other than Carter. The conflict quickly came to an end. Upon seeing the intimidating knight, no one dared to say another word. In the evening, when they returned to May's residence, she poured a glass of wine for Carter. Carter was surprised to see that the home of the most popular actor in the western region was so ordinary. May explained that she had used all her savings to purchase this small, old house located in a deep alley of the inner city. Although the house was small and worn out, moving away from the outer city would at least protect her from harassment and prying eyes of ill intentions. Carter awkwardly apologized, but May smiled and reassured him that it was fine. She poured herself a small glass of wine and asked Carter if he had come to sort out the theater's order and resolve the disputes among the actors. Carter shook his head and replied that it was Timothy causing trouble again, and the main forces were on their way. He had come ahead to make preparations and also really wanted to see May's performance. May froze for a moment, then shook her head. These things shouldn't have been told to her. Carter said he knew where to draw the line, and it wasn't a covert operation either. May promptly took the glass of wine from Carter's hand, saying that he shouldn't drink during mission. However, after everything settles down, she would gladly invite him for a proper drink. As for Carter's previous invitation, she already had an answer in her heart. Some things can only be known after trying. Border town is where she truly wanted to stay. She had decided to move to the border town with her father after the performance is over. Roland arrived at the Changu stronghold 2 days later. Petrovan members of the 5 major families greeted the prince. Roland stated that the exact number and route of Timothy's forces were still unknown, but they were undoubtedly targeting the western frontier. Based on Timothy's usual tactics, they would likely recruit civilians through pillaging and then use drugs to force them into attacking. One of the family members was unclear about the drugs mentioned, so Roland explained that they were evil pills that could grant civilians powers stronger than knights, but once the effect wore off, the users would die in helpless agony. Roland ordered them to bring all their family members and the local civilians into the stronghold. One of the family members mentioned their warehouse with food and goods, but Roland firmly interrupted, saying they had only 3 days to transport as much as they could, but it was essential to gather all the civilians within the stronghold. He cannot allow Timothy and his troops to harm the civilians. After the meeting, the prince summoned Axe into the castle. Roland did not reveal the true information he possessed to the nobles. Thanks to Lightning and Macy's meticulous reconnaissance, the team from the capital city had been exposed. Unlike the previous invaders, they were now sailing on a single-masted ship, following the main channel of the Crimson Water River, heading west into the center of the western region. This was a particularly tricky route. Once the enemy crossed the fork in the river, they could either turn back along the tributary to attack the southern and eastern gates of the Changji stronghold or continue westward, straight to the border town. To avoid the dilemma of dividing forces for defense, Roland had to proactively concentrate his superior forces to defeat the enemy in one decisive blow. Clearly, the fork in the Crimson Water River was the most suitable ambush location. Roland left 100 soldiers to guard the Changji stronghold while he himself would join the front lines after organizing the stronghold's defenses. Nightingale felt uneasy, but Roland reassured her that he had to go. He needed to utilize the abilities of the witches. A white-tailed kite glided through the sky before landing gracefully on Roland's shoulder. Roland summoned the witches and began discussing the creation of bunkers and tanks. The concept of bunkers was already familiar to them, but they had never heard of tanks before. Roland sketched a simple design, explaining that it was a carriage with a cannon mounted on it. However, he mentioned that they couldn't truly call it a tank yet, as they didn't have enough horses. Nevertheless, Honey could gather wild beasts to assist them. Nanoa asked if beasts pulling cannons could be considered tanks, to which Roland replied earnestly, "Of course. They can call them tiger style and leopard style." Next, Roland shared his plan with Lien. He intended to establish defensive lines on both sides of the main river channel. He used sticks to create a rough diagram, but Lien didn't fully understand. While it would allow the soldiers to hide effectively, she doubted it would prevent Timothy's fleet from passing through. Roland didn't offer much explanation, simply stating that there's no way for them to be able to get through. Then he turned to Leaf and tasked her with concealing the fortifications. He instructed her to use weeds and vines, making the bunkers appear more natural and blend in with the surroundings. Leaf assured Lien that they should trust the prince. In Roland's mind, he imagined how, once the cannons were pushed into the well-disguised fortifications, each compartment would fire rounds after rounds. The 16 field cannons would maintain their accuracy despite the rough terrain. In fact, at such a close range, they could hit the sailing ships in the middle of the river even with their eyes closed. The enemy would find themselves in a disadvantageous formation. The enemy fleet arrived at the fork in the Crimson Water River half a day later than anticipated. Upon receiving the news, Vaynor gave the preparedness order to the artillery crews and then returned to his own position. Each compartment had a shooting window and a hole near the top of the wall. Climbing 2 steps of the earthen tower allowed for a convenient view of the situation on the river. The soldiers chatted and laughed, happily wiping the cannonballs. Vaynor sighed inwardly. These guys had lost their sense of tension. They no longer trembled like they did on the battlefield several months ago. He couldn't say whether this change was good or bad, as he felt they were underestimating their opponents. However, he couldn't harshly reprimand his subordinates either, because he himself wasn't any better. Since becoming soldiers under the prince, their understanding of combat had undergone a dramatic transformation. Bloody and brutal fighting seemed unrelated to strength, skill, or bravery. They simply repeated the memorized steps from their training, prepare and fire towards the enemy according to training to achieve victory. Alongside the assistance of the witches, they hadn't lost a single battle. One soldier even thought that it would be great if he got injured so he could see the angel Nanoa. Vaynor punched him on the head, telling him to pay attention to the enemy situation. Just as Vaynor was lost in his thoughts, the warning from the scouts brought him back. The soldiers changed their expressions and started loading ammunition seriously, waiting for orders. The compartments became bustling with activity. They had practiced this step too many times. They silently awaited the arrival of the attack signal flag. The fleet, now visible in the distance, was getting closer and closer to their ambush location. However, Prince Roland had still not given any orders. Sylvie and Lien grew increasingly anxious, fearing that they might not have time for the messengers to relay their commands. It was almost too late to stop the fleet from passing through the fork in the Crimson Water River. Roland instructed the 2 witches to listen, and suddenly, a deafening roar reverberated across the river. As if it were a signal to attack, thick smoke mixed with flames erupted from over a dozen bunkers, accompanied by the continuous rumbling of thunderous explosions. Lien redirected her gaze back to the river, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. There were no knights or mercenaries engaged in close combat, yet the deck of the first sailing ship seemed to explode. Wood splinters and body parts scattered in all directions, and the crew on the ship were instantly killed or injured, with blood mist rising and staining the deck. She can only see a black sphere being shot out from the bunkers, which she thought was useless, swaying for a moment before crashing down with a thunderous impact, knocking two knights who had just climbed from the cabin to the deck. Sylvie finally understood what the prince meant by "they won't make it through." However, how did his subordinates manage to achieve this? Compared to Lien, who was observing from a distance, Sylvie had a more vivid view of the scene. It was the first time she had witnessed such a sight. No sharp blades or spears were needed. With just round, rolling spheres, people were torn apart. As her vision was too close, she even felt that the blood and entrails of those killed were splashing onto her own body. Several others were struck by the iron spheres, either severing limbs or shattering their skulls. The ship's cabin was now filled with flowing fluids and a mix of red and white. Suddenly, the witch felt a surge of nausea and started puking. Prince Roland noticed her discomfort and handed her a handkerchief, advising her not to use her abilities to watch any further. Sylvie took the handkerchief and wiped her mouth. This was probably the incredible invention that Maisie and Lightning had mentioned, but at that time, no one paid much attention or thought much of it. After all, it was hard to imagine such an astonishing weapon without witnessing it firsthand. She turned her gaze back to the battlefield and saw the Timothy fleet beginning to approach the banks. However, they were unaware that Prince Roland had set up fortifications in more than just one location. But the soldiers inside the bunkers did not give them a chance. The soldiers just aimed their weapons at the targets and easily pulled the trigger. The enemy couldn't hold on for long before collapsing completely. Those who had disembarked from the ships tried to get back on board, while those waiting to disembark scrambled in all directions. The prince put down his binoculars and ordered Axe to take the reserve troops to clear the battlefield. He wanted the leader to be captured. Roland asked Sylvie to follow Axe, as he doesn't want anyone escaping. With a nod, Sylvie agreed to accompany Axe. She suddenly understood why Prince Roland dared to openly protect the witches in this corner of the continent. With such formidable power at his disposal, even Church's divine punishment army would not easily defeat him. Axe arrived with two prisoners. Before Roland could even inquire, one of them began shouting loudly, claiming to be a Bart Knight and requesting permission to write a letter to his family. He assured them that his family would undoubtedly offer a generous ransom. The other person introduced himself as a nobleman's second son and expressed willingness to pay a ransom as well. Roland raised an eyebrow in response. He asked if these two were the ones who led the attack. Both of them were frightened and hastily pointed out Sir Vincent was the leader, but he had perished during the first wave of the attack. They also requested to have their ropes removed, hoping to receive proper treatment. The prince shook his head and stated that no ransom was necessary. However, if they were willing to reveal Timothy's plan and any information they possessed, he might consider granting them better treatment. The two individuals hesitated for a moment but declined the offer, explaining that they had sworn allegiance to Timothy and could not betray their oath. Roland shrugged indifferently and ordered his guards to take them away and hand them over to Axe. Roland turned around and told Axe that he had no restrictions on the methods or means to obtain sufficient intelligence. He made it clear that he would show no mercy towards those who had captured and harmed innocent civilians and dared to invade the Western Territory. Roland's tone grew cold. Once you're done questioning them, treat them as deceased. After a few days, Roland returned to the border town. Axe also brought all the information obtained from the interrogation. Roland